much. And wanted to reiterate what Paul said about how strong the papers have been. And, you know, I've stopped going to conferences because I often don't learn anything, and today has been exceptional. So thank you to everyone. Okay, it was really, really helpful to have Cobbina's opening talk to frame some of the issues that, when I was thinking about the paper I was going to present, I was thinking, oh goodness, there's all kinds of gaps and breaks in what I'm presenting. I don't know if it's going to make sense and fit in. But actually a lot of the things that he was teasing out around looking at this sort of networks of connection, particularly teachers and students, and the sort of socialist kind of affiliations was really helpful, and I hope has presented a little bit of a grounding to what I'm presenting. My paper is taken from a chapter called, is that okay? Conceptualizing Black British Art Through the Lens of Exile, that was published in his book Exiles, Diasporas and Strangers as part of the Annotating Arts Histories series. And so what I'm doing is just sort of extracting elements from that essay for today and trying to, there are aspects of it that I'm revising at present, so it's a good opportunity to sort of air it at this venue. So I want to start off with this quote from Edward Said's essay of 1990, and Reflections on Exile. Exile cannot be made to serve notions of humanism. On the 20th century scale, exile is neither aesthetically nor humanistically comprehensible. At most, the literature about exile objectifies an anguish and a predicament most people rarely experience at first hand. But to think of the exile informing this literature as beneficially humanistic is to banalise its mutilations, the losses it inflicts on those who suffer them, the muteness with which it responds to any attempt to understand it as good for us. Now, in this essay, I see Said as refusing to align himself with the trauma of refusing to align the trauma of displacement with the humanistic impulses of Western culture, and his observation that exile is irremediably secular and unbearably historical places the subject's alienation at the centre of the collisions between aesthetics and politics in the late 20th century. Gavin Yangi's, Mitra Chabrizian and Mona Hatoum are key figures in the history of post-war British art, whose presence in the metropolitan centres of Europe in the late 70s and 1980s was the consequence of political upheaval. Now, even if these artists would not readily classify themselves as exiles, their politicised perspectives contributed to the wider anti-humanist impulses of the post-colonial and postmodern critique of Western culture that I want to argue, or have argued in this essay, parallel conceptual artists who, it's often noted, took up an anti-humanist view of modernism. And I'm examining specifically Gavin Yanchi's A South African Colouring Book of 1974 and 5, Mona Hatoum's performance works between 1982 and 5, and Mitra Chabrizian's The Blues of 1986. And I'm exploring how their strategies can be said to constitute the negative of a nationalist narrative that Said argues is central to the politics of exile. In these artist practices, the creative possibilities of exile lie in the simultaneity of maintaining multiple perspectives. And Said sort of argues at a later section of the essay, seeing the entire world as a foreign land makes possible originality of vision. Most people are principally aware of one culture, one setting, one home. Exiles are aware of at least two, and this plurality of vision gives rise to an awareness of simultaneous dimensions, an awareness that, to borrow a phrase from music, is contrapuntal. For an exile, habits of life, expression, or activity in a new environment inevitably occur against the memory of these things in another environment. Thus, both the new and the old environments are vivid, actual, occurring together contrapuntally. there is a unique pleasure in this sort of apprehension, especially if the exile is conscious of other contrapuntal juxtapositions that diminish orthodox judgment and elevate appreciative sympathy. So this idea of a kind of contrapuntal juxtaposition is, in a sense, what I'm examining in the work of these particular artists, and how I suppose I'm sort of placing them by thinking of them in a broader view of conceptual art than might have otherwise been sort of framed in the past. And one of the sort of key things that I'm trying to draw out is again taken from Said in his book Culture and Imperialism of 1994. He said, he sets out the way that the contrapuntal awareness of the exile can inform a methodology that allows one to make concurrent those views and experiences that are ideologically and culturally close to each other. So where one might suggest that the sort of trajectory of conceptual art in Britain, for certain reasons via Victor Berlin and John Staysaker, might have been, and art and language might have been sympathetic but separate to the sort of questions of race, identity and belonging that come up as a result of some of the interventions we've seen today. This concept of the contrapuntal is, I'm kind of trying to mobilise it to suggest points of contact. Not to put one as subservient to the other, but to have them speak to each other like refrains in a musical composition. I don't think the talk will be that elegant, but that's the idea, is to sort of think about those connections. And one sort of valuable sort of point of reference is Michael Newman's 1996 essay, Conceptual Art from the 1960s to the 1990s, an unfinished project, where he looks at or questions how conventional modes of conceptual art have been examined, and suggests that there's a sort of epistemic bias towards a reflexive self-transparency that's no longer compatible with art making in a multicultural world. One of the sort of difficulties of that is there is sort of a neat divide between the moment of 68 and then postmodernism. But if you look at the work of Rashid Araeen and Paki Bastard and some of the photo-conceptual work we've seen, these sort of neat divisions are clearly not that helpful. So, something to be unpicked, perhaps. One of the important references for this sort of rethinking was an essay by Peter Wallen in the exhibition catalogue Global Conceptualisms, and the essay rethought this the particular sort of geographical specificity of conceptual art as it's been kind of narrated in the sort of orthodox stories of post-war art history as one that's sort of confined to New York and concerned with certain kinds of language games coming from Joseph Kossuth and Sol LeWitt, etc., etc. And he sort of teases that apart, relocates that within the era of the 67, 69 and period of political militancy, cultural upheaval, ranging across Black Power, the student movement, solidarity with the Third World struggles, the beginning of feminism, the Summer of Love, and organised opposition to the Vietnam War. So kind of seeing that political radicalism as a massive impetus for reframing, rethinking what conceptual art might or might not be, how it might be understood. One of the key elements or sort of strategies he evokes to shift this geographically is to signal a move away from the Wittgensteinian language games of people like Joseph Kossuth towards Victor Bergen and John Staysaker's interest in Roland Barthes' elements of semiology, and to think about semiotics, encoding and decoding as a strategy for engaging with popular culture as part of a sort of more democratic art practice. So you've got the opening up of a culture sphere so that advertising is loaded with cultural meaning, whereas before it might have just been sort of banal and ideologically neutral or seen as such. So the shift towards then the kinds of interpretations around image text formation that one might see, say, with Rashid's work, or I'd like to argue you can see in Gavin Yancey's work, open up that at a sort of wider level. One of the things I should say that in writing this particular chapter, I was not able to access a wider sort of context of the specificities of the South African context, but have been grateful to Christine Ayin, who has brought this out in a recent essay, who's looked at the issues around some of the imagery in this series of prints by Gavin Yancey's, and located them in the work of exiled photographers such as George Hallett, who's based in Birmingham and was part of a diaspora that was sort of active here. But so I'm sort of presenting you this sort of reading, but with this proviso that there is a really fantastic essay by Christine that you should look at. But this series of prints, if you haven't come across them, I accessed them from the British Library as a sort of loose folio of pages, and in sort of trying to make sense of them when I first came across them, had sort of conflicting kind of impressions of them. In one way, they come across very much as a whole, as a political tract or a pamphlet. I just let you know the scale. They're quite small, so 45 by 60 centimetres, a collection of... I'll just show you the whole lot of them in case you haven't seen them before. Okay, it's just what they individually look like. Okay, so a series of printed loose sheets were produced originally as an edition of 20 and placed in a folio and created in 74 to 75, and they look like they were silkscreen prints that were then sort of printed in a smaller scale on these pages. And in 1978, an introduction was added to it that included a quote by Steve Biko. "We must learn to accept that no group, however benevolent, can ever hand power to the vanquished on a plate. We must accept that the limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." One of the sort of issues at stake here, or one of the sort of references that comes up throughout this series of sheets, is the work of Fanon, and there's clearly an echo from Biko's statement in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth as a call to arms. And the statement is followed by a sort of very chilling account of Biko's death by the South African police in that statement. So it confirms the identity of the folio as a political pamphlet that targets the Verwoerd era. And Verwoerd was elected in 1948 and orchestrated the identity of South Africa as a white republic in the face of African national liberation movements, then sweeping the rest of the continent. And one of the things that I explore and sort of examine throughout this sort of series of images is this concept of spatial engineering that David Goldblatt uses that term to frame the particular segregation that happens in South Africa of sort of confining blacks to townships and sort of shipping them in to white centres for labour purposes and then shipping them back out again, or kind of moving them back out again. And so this sort of violence that operates on a level of language and on the level of the psychic effects, what I'm suggesting Jantjies is doing is sort of enacting a kind of decolonisation of that. And he uses Fanon's essay, let me see, it's of 1955, which he quotes a fair bit. Racism and Culture, which he gave in 1955 in Paris at the first Congress of Negro Artists and Writers. And it's sort of a coincidental or kind of parallel to Bart's sort of deconstruction of the cover of Paris Match with the sort of young Negro, quote-unquote Negro soldier saluting the tricolour. So there's a moment where there's sort of structuralist semiotics enacted by Bart is sort of parallel to Fanon's call for a decolonisation of culture as part of the necessary step of independence and freedom from colonial rule. Let me just go into a bit more detail. So in each of these, the premise of the whole thing, of course, as a South African colouring book, is to evoke the world of the child and of learning. So you've got the palette at the bottom, and you've got these sort of coloured bars that are used to check the accuracy of the colour of the print when it comes out from the printers. So that sort of referencing of palettes and the colouring book suggests the education of the child. So it's sort of evoking partly the infantilism of black artists in the South African context, but it's also pushing on problems of pedagogy and education and civilizing mission to sort of parody that, so that there are sort of sections in it so that on that sort of folio on the right you see photographs of the Sharpeville massacre and a statement saying, "Colour these people dead." And this continues throughout the whole series and links up on the top left. You see gold mining and the sort of statistics from financial world to link the two. The image on the far left of a woman on her knees cleaning the public street. Again, this sort of connection between race and labour that's brought together to critique the operations of apartheid as sort of in the service of capital. So all of these sort of very loaded, very kind of highly politicised photojournalism is being brought together, most of it coming from, particularly that image of the woman on her knees cleaning, coming from Ernest Cole's House of Bondage, a very important photographer who was exiled, and the work was then published and distributed around the world as a way of sort of raising consciousness about the situation. So the relationship between photojournalism and activism around the political situation at the time is sort of brought together and at various junctures through the text. Janshi switches some of the captions that are taken from Coles's original book and replaces them with sort of quotes from Fanon's text to kind of create a different kind of intertextual set of interpretations. At the top right is his passport, or ID card, I should say, and sort of at the bottom a kind of indication of the complexities of the attempt of the authorities to hold on to very strict lines of black and white in South Africa, given the kind of range of interracial kind of relationships that were already taking place that made that very unstable. Okay. And I suppose that in looking and thinking about the image on the far left of the woman on her knees cleaning and the relationship of race to labour, I was reminded of the Victor Bergen photograph of the Asian woman in the factory in UK 77, which Kobiner showed at I think it was the first image he showed in his lecture. It seemed to be sort of possible to make connections about that colonial situation resurging in Britain. The other aspect of this work that I haven't had an opportunity to explore is its impact or possible impact on younger artists of your generation, how much you knew about it, because it was exhibited at the ICA in 1977. Did you guys see it? Okay, because this is what I'm dying to know. I want to know how, because I haven't been able to have these conversations. So this to me, this sort of, the fact that it was shown there suggests that already the sort of level of protest against the South African regime that was happening in Britain, and the mobilisation of that, support for that, the ending of that regime in London, creates this sort of geographical shift that aligns the people around questions of African colonialism of African people and that liberation. So it connects the US, South Africa, and the situation in Birmingham. There was a caption or a headline news in one of the Birmingham local papers at a certain point around the time of the riots, asking if Harlem was going to come to Birmingham. This sort of attempt to...
I'm just going to make this very small interjection to say that at the Black Art Gallery, there was a show of Gabby Hanchett's prints, which was...
Right.
I think, I was just as you were showing, I thought, when did I first see this actual work? And that's one of the things that came out of having a Black Art Gallery in Finsbury Park.
That was being shown, and that was the date of that was... So, and we're talking when?
We're talking early 80s.
Early 80s.
It was after the ICA.
It was like, yeah.
But it was again shown within that context.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm aware I'm at the end of the day and I've got very little time, so I'm going to move this on, but that's really fantastic. It was the one thing I was hoping to get from today, to find out. All right. Again, in the context of this sort of contrapuntal of the experience of multiple realities at the same time, moving rather swiftly on to this, I was thinking of Mana Hatoum, who originally came to London just as a trip and then got stuck here because Beirut was being bombed, of Palestinian origin, and her family left Gaza in 1948 as a result of the Nakba, which means catastrophe, invasion of the area by Israeli soldiers. And that has a particular kind of significance for the reading of some of the things I look at. But this particular piece with her sort of sliding in mud, the radio reports of bombings in Beirut are being kind of heard outside of that space where you see her. A negotiating table similarly has that sort of connection to it, but also in the light of what we know now with the sort of extent of the civil war in Lebanon and the amount of torture that was routinely taking place on multiple sides of the conflict. One of the things that I was sort of trying to draw out and looking at the contrapuntal there and thinking about this shift of space and time comes from the research of Janet Ancori, who looks at the Nakba and mentions the sort of traumatic experience of violent removal by Israeli soldiers in her book. Actually, Ancori looks at this particular piece and she says it's sort of her tomb lying naked, surrounded by entrails, and she attributes this to repetition in her later sculptures, but also to a memory, a traumatic memory that's not Hatoum's, but of her mother's experience of the Deir Yin massacre in 1948. The massacre was conducted by an extreme right-wing Jewish militant group who slaughtered a village of men and women and children, and according to an eyewitness account, they slashed the belly of at least one pregnant woman. And as reports of these atrocities spread throughout Palestine, the fear they created led Hatoum's family to leaving everything they owned behind them. So the sense of memory and the kind of collision of the present and the past and the geographical dimensions of these shifts, I think, come through in work like this. Marianne Hirsch's Family Frames Photography, Narrative and Post-Memory examines the idea of the memory of violence as something that a generation does not experience themselves but has been passed on to them through their parents or their grandparents, and I think that's particularly important here. But in relation to the history of sort of civil unrest in Brixton, I think this particular piece by Hatoum seems very relevant. Roadworks of 1985, which it takes place around the Cold Harbour Lane area and evokes undoubtedly the memory of the civil unrest in 1981 that took place nearby. And it's a sort of complex piece, this sort of being followed by her own boots, which seems absurd, but at the same time is quite a fragile image and gives a sense of vulnerability, kind of playing off associations of femininity and masculinity at the same time. But her persona that she creates in a lot of the work, in a boiler suit with a sort of balaclava, she's sort of somewhere between soldier, militant, terrorist, this sort of unplaced figure. And one of the things that I think is significant about her sort of position, or the way I'm positioning her in this sort of overview of sort of cultural politics read through strategies of conceptual art, is that like Bergen, these kinds of practices are specifically pitched against painting as a dominant model. The New Image in Painting was a key exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1981. Joachim Christodes, I'll try and get the name right, in his introduction, triumphantly proclaims that artists have returned to the studio to paint, and isn't it wonderful? We've got wonderful paint on canvas, and none of that nasty conceptual art that was not good to look at and was giving us a headache. You know, I'm kind of paraphrasing. But these kinds of resistance to it, and locating Hatoum's work and Jantji's work, at least how it might have been received in the context of London, even if South Africa was the context of the making of the work, suggests a sort of pitting of these kinds of practices against that dominant aesthetic. And one aspect of that is the way in which the temporality of performance eludes the fixity of representation. Clearly this is documentation, but I think it's interesting to look at her work in relation to an argument proposed by Peggy Phelan, who argues that the radicalism of performance art lies in its presenting of an ontology without reproduction. She says, without a copy, live performance plugs into visibility in a maniacally charged present and disappears into memory in the realm of invisibility and the unconscious, where it eludes regulation and control. So the temporality of that becomes significant. And just to end this section, she did a performance in what used to be a stately home that had become a kind of art centre around the mid-80s, where she crawls on her belly along this sort of very kind of, I think it's in the dining area of this, it's South Hill Park in Bracknell, publicly funded art centre established in 1973. It was formerly a private estate for William Watts, a senior official within the Bengal government, and has a very sort of conventional 18th century landscape and architecture. And I sort of was interested in her intervention in that space, again, disrupting the sort of aesthetics of the 18th century, but also what I was wanting to do was also compare it to someone like Richard Long and his sort of inevitable and interminable walks into the countryside and kind of maybe not sentimentality of the countryside, but the problems of land art in Britain that doesn't necessarily have the critique of institutions that was there, say, in the States. So I think something's going on in that body of work that sort of could be contextualised in that way. Okay, just coming finally to the last section of the talk on Mitra Tabrizian. This is a project called The Blues, and it was her PhD research that she did with Victor Bergen as his student. And it sort of draws on the kind of tableau format that we see in some of his work, but it sort of enters her practice in a very systematic way. And in sort of previous projects like College of Fashion or Governmentality, she sort of uses the tableau format to sort of critique the sort of social and gendered structures around her. But this particular later work takes on Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, and creates a series of tableaus, but draws on doubling and splitting to often pit black and white male figures together, often dressed in very similar clothing, with texts and scenarios that evoke the aesthetic of film noir. And a lot of film theory from about the 70s, 80s onwards was very invested in examining the legacy of film noir, and it sort of enters this work in a significant way. And the work was also discussed by Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall in their conference, I think in 1985, at the ICA, called Identity, the Real Me, discussing it in the context of their critique of Frederick Jameson's The Condition of Postmodernism, that sort of doesn't acknowledge the nature of alienation for the black subject within the urban context. And it's sort of relocating that discourse into the strategies of postmodern that define that particular event, but also foreground to Britsingh's work. And what I was interested in exploring in this particular piece was the sort of relay of gazes and also this sort of construction of a white gaze, and a section from Stuart Hall's essay sort of comes to mind in kind of articulating the alliance of power and the gaze. It's a text called The Whites of Their Eyes. And it's what I was trying to get at is sort of indicate a space that is visually absent in the photograph, but psychically apprehended by the racially marked subject. And this is what Stuart Hall draws out in his essay, The White of Their Eyes. That place he identifies it as the place of the absent but imperialising white eye, the unmarked position from which all of these observations are made and from which alone they make sense. This is the history of slavery and conquest, written, seen, drawn and photographed by the winners. They cannot be read and made sense from any other position. The white eye is always outside the frame, but seeing and positioning everything within it. So I was just thinking about this construction of the imperial white gaze and then sort of trying to contextualise it by looking at the work of someone like Barbara Kruger, where the construction of the gaze is placed in a purely gendered context of a Lacanian gaze, but figured also through the pose. And looking at Craig Owen's essay on that, it would be too complicated to go into that at this stage, but it's one of the aspects of this sort of interpretation of this sort of relay of gazes, in particular the white figured bust in the corner that seemed to sort of evoke that kind of tableau and a fear fantasy formulation that comes from Homi Bhabha's writings. And so in these different ways, I was sort of trying to tease out how, and out of the past, of course, this idea of the sort of colonial past being absolutely at the centre of these kind of fear fantasy formulation and the construction of these scenarios of a phobic object, in effect. And in these different ways, through these examinations of the contrapunctal dislocation of space and time, to suggest ways not only of teasing out those elements within the work, but also thinking about their relationship to works that they may not conventionally be connected to. Okay, thank you.